Okay, so the socioeconomic value, we're really going to be looking at the ecosystem services, and for looking at mostly monetary values and how do you put a monetary value on those, similar to some of the stuff I was just talking about. I'm going to go in a little bit more depth in these pieces of this talk. All of the values that I'm going to talk about are in US dollars. I've tried to change all of the aerial values in here into hectares, make it easier. Okay, so the value of wetlands globally. This is a statistic that I always find fascinating. If you look at the global benefits provided by wetlands, if you add everything up, the global value of the wetland services is about $14.9 trillion per year. If you look at the gross domestic product of the United States in 2011, it was $15 trillion. So the global value of the wetlands is equal to the gross domestic product of the entire United States. It's a very, very valuable resource. It generates all of the values that we see across the board, from the tourism to the cultural resources, to the provisioning services that we saw, the timber and the products and the food organisms that we can pull from the wetlands as well. That does not count the value of the exploitation of, say, oil and gas minerals from those wetlands as well. So that's just the value of the services provided by the wetlands, not the resource value that's contained within. It doesn't account for the peat value. There's vast resources of peat that's collected in the northern part of the United Kingdom as a resource, as a fuel. It doesn't count that. It doesn't count coal reserves. It doesn't count natural gas. So just the value of the resources itself. If you add all that into there, it would probably double. 75% of all commercially harvested fish are wetland dependent, either caught and living their entire life within a wetland or spending a portion of their life within a wetland. So again, that nutrient value of the water coming into the sea, the lagoon area for the wetland, is vitally important to those fish. If you add shellfish species into that, you're looking at something like 95% of all commercially collected fish and shellfish have some level of wetland dependency. The only species that really don't are the open ocean fish, the tunas, the dorado, and things like that don't generally spend much of their life cycle within a wetland itself, but almost everything else does. So there's interdependence across the board. The ability of wetlands to control erosion is a theme that I'm going to talk about on a number of the topics later this afternoon. Is so valuable that every coastal state in the United States has developed some type of wetland restoration program, recognizing the value and the importance of having wetlands to help control erosion along coastlines and along river systems is absolutely vital, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And the way the United States has addressed it is through these development of restoration programs. And I'm going to talk about restoration programs later on in the afternoon when we talk about restoration and mitigation management. The wetlands themselves, in fact, this is a great cartoon picture of a mangrove, and it was something that we heard earlier. The numbers of species that live in amongst the roots and the complexity of the mangrove forest is immense. As an ecologist, we always like to say that diversity is driven by the three-dimensionality of the ecosystem. So if you have a flat, sandy beach, you have animals there, but it's not very diverse. If you have a coral reef that's three-dimensional, that has holes and places to hide and animals that can go out, the more three-dimensionality you have, the more animals that you've got. And a mangrove forest is about as three-dimensional as you can get. It's water-filled. The water tends to be tidally cycled, moves up and down. It's flooded, it's not flooded. It's got holes and nooks and crannies and lots of surface area. So it tends to be an area that is vitally important to maintaining that level of biodiversity. In the past few years, particularly in the United States, we've seen some drastic impacts to our wetlands through the major hurricanes that have come through. Sandy most recently, Katrina, and before Katrina, Rita, that hit all within, again, the last 10 years. These storms have been very intense and have destroyed vast sections of wetland and have caused massive erosion in areas where there used to be wetlands. So the importance of that wetland as a buffer zone, as a maintenance of the biodiversity cannot be understated. So let's talk a little bit about this Hurricane Sandy that happened a couple of weeks ago. This was the largest Atlantic storm that was ever been recorded. It was 1,700 kilometers in diameter at its biggest point. There were 209 fatalities across 7 countries as Sandy made its path up from the area just north of here, through Cuba, and all the way into the upper northeast of the United States. The economic losses alone from that particular storm were estimated at $52.5 billion, making it, as I said before, the second most expensive storm in US history. In New York City alone, there was widespread flooding, and was the first time that the subway system in New York was flooded. It really brought the message home to, I think, a lot of people in big urban areas that don't think about wetlands and don't think about coastal zone management, how important having that coastal zone management was when that storm surge went through Manhattan and filled up certain subway systems that are still today filled with water. In some of the areas that were damaged during Hurricane Sandy, particularly along the New Jersey coast, will probably never be rebuilt. Houses are gone. Places where there were houses are now 3-4 meters deep water. That's never going to be built on again. That's now ocean. So not having the wetlands historically lost along the upper northeast of the United States was devastating when these big, powerful storms come through. And as we mentioned with Sandy and Katrina and Rita, these big storms are becoming more and more frequent. There's a couple of different approaches to what to do about the loss of the wetlands related to Hurricane Sandy. And Julia has been working on some of these. So these are slides that she put in here, but I wanted to leave them in here because I think that they're interesting concepts for urbanized areas that really don't think about wetlands very much. In order to dissipate the storm surge and the flooding risks, there's actually several proposals on the table right now to develop new wetland areas around some of the big urbanized areas. This is an artist's picture of Manhattan, lower Manhattan, where rather than having large areas of buildings, the proposals are to go in and take some of these large urban areas and actually remove some of the buildings and try to replace some of the wetlands with a manufactured wetland that would give it some level of storm surge protection. These are all concepts right now, and whether they'll actually come to fruition or not is anybody's guess. But there are proposals now to do that along there and along the Hudson River Valley. I don't have a good picture. Hudson River runs from about where Manhattan is up to the north. It's the biggest river system really that runs right through Manhattan and through the major populated part of New York City. That particular area is developed right up to the banks of the river. So there's no more wetlands. It's rocky, channelized riprap, and it has nowhere to go. So every time there's now a flood system that comes down or a storm surge that goes up the river, the water has nowhere to go but over the tops and onto the people that live literally meters away from these. Very similar to the situation that we saw in New Orleans, where the people lived right next to the levees. So for protection for these potential future economic disasters, wetlands are starting to be looked at again as positive things that we need to start to think about adding back into our landscape that we've taken away. The coastal wetlands of the Gulf Coast of the United States, so from Texas to Louisiana to Mississippi, Alabama, down to Florida, are probably the largest area in the United States that has coastal wetlands. And if you look just at the wetlands of Louisiana, these are the wetlands from the Mississippi Delta. The economic value of that is about $1,000 per hectare, and that comes from the fisheries, collection of animals. There's a lot of animal trapping, fur trade that still takes place in Louisiana. Recreation, both recreational sport fishing and recreational people that go into the beach, people that want to go into the swamps and do airboat rides to see alligators and all of that. And then also the storm protection on that. $1,000 per hectare in just the economic value of the benefit that theirs are getting right there. If you look at commercial fishing in the Gulf of Mexico and animal trapping in there, they account for about 19% of the total of that $1,000 per hectare. Recreation is about 2% of that total. So big pieces of that value are captured in the commercial fishing aspect, the animal work, and then also the recreation. So the storm protection and services and things make up the remainder of that value. But that was a study that was done a few years ago to try to put a value on on a wetland in Louisiana. That was actually done before Deepwater Horizon oil spill. The coastal wetlands of Louisiana also provide an essential habitat for migratory birds and species. About 75% of all migratory birds that travel into North America go through the wetlands of Louisiana. Most of them are traveling up from South America into North America. They all stop at some point or travel through that vast wetland of the Mississippi Delta. Seabirds, wading birds, fur bearers, sport, commercial fishing all take place in this particular area. This is a photograph of the wetland right along the side, just to this part of the coastline. This is where the New Orleans city is. Mississippi River comes in here. This particular wetland area in here. This is a pretty typical view of it. Coastal sand dunes behind, open ocean out here, coastal sand dunes, and then lagoons and wetlands to the inside. The general benefits from the fish and wildlife habitat alone, $202 million a year accounted for from commercial fishing. That's 21% of the total commercial fish catch in the United States comes from Louisiana. The recreational fishing alone is an $895 million a year industry. Hunting, deer hunting, duck hunting. In Louisiana, you can hunt just about everything down there. $500 to $600 million a year in that. Wildlife watching, just the benefit of having people go out and do birding and looking at animals, $175 million a year. The collection of animals for fur, another $1 million a year. And there's actually a fairly robust, in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, a fairly robust alligator harvest that takes place that accounts for another $30 million a year. So a very lucrative portion of the services provided by the wetlands. From a tourism standpoint, the Gulf supports about a $20 billion a year tourist industry, mostly because of the beaches and the recreational activities that depend on the healthy wetlands. Shoreline protection, we talked about that. Louisiana is losing about 6,500 to 9,000 hectares of wetlands per year to sea level rise and storms. I'm going to show you some pictures of that a little bit later on. Hurricanes Katrina and Rita transformed 56,000 hectares of marshland in coastal Louisiana. We've lost 1.6 kilometers of wetland. When you lose that much of the wetland, you're going to lose an estimated $5 to $7 million in property damage from potential storms. Water quality improvement takes place. The filtering capacity of the Mississippi River alone contributes to more than 90% of the fresh water that enters the Gulf. The filtering capacity of that wetland is equal to the capacity of about a $5 million water treatment facility that you can build. So you get that kind of natural treatment from a wetland. Flood storage, again, 1 hectare of wetland can store about 14.2 million liters of water from flood areas. That's water that won't get out into the population. Great floods of the Mississippi in 1993, which is a photograph of this down here, resulted in billions of dollars in damage, numbers of death, and 8 million hectares of wetland along that particular area had been removed and filled prior to the flood. So if we had those 8 million hectares of wetlands back, the flood probably wouldn't have been nearly as damaging. Again, here's some additional resources for interpretation and valuation of wetlands. Thank you for that. I think we've got time for some questions.